Hello everybody, this is Chris Hattingh, researcher at the Free Market Foundation. Thank you for joining me on another solo podcast. Today I wanted to unpack a little bit and talk about the concept of capitalism and its implications for politics, economics, and social life in general in South Africa. I'm sure you've heard the concept of radical economic transformation over the years. Maybe if you've just started reading about politics and philosophy, you'll now come across it, but it's been bandied about a lot on especially people who consider themselves on the left of the political spectrum. Radical economic transformation is supposed to contain measures such as redress for past injustices, fixing the inequality gap in South Africa, which is very heavily skewed along racial lines. It also contains, within radical economic transformation, it contains justification for the use of force in applying these measures. It's also used to justify interventionist policies by the state in people's lives, because the end goal is supposedly noble. It's supposed to be an equalization of resources within society. It operates on the flawed notion that wealth is fixed, and that, I don't know, maybe every day, at the beginning of every day when the sun comes up, maybe at the beginning of the week on Mondays or the beginning of a new year, the wealth in the country is divided up, and a certain race group gets more and other race groups then receive their smaller portions. It's based on a false notion of how wealth is created. It sees wealth as fixed. But I just wanted to sort of couch radical economic transformation within the history of ideas. You see, if you look at colonialism, apartheid, and various policies nowadays, they're all based on the notion of force. Colonialism was British force, and then apartheid was the National Party enforcing their plan on society. But all of these are, from colonialism to apartheid to now, all these measures by the government to control the lives of South Africans are premised on the use of force. And I think throughout human history, all societies which have gone the totalitarian route, the collectivist route, have been premised on force, on the idea that the state, or a group in charge of the power of the state, is more knowledgeable than the rest of us and is entitled to guide us in certain directions, no matter how radical the interventions they might need to apply. This is from Nazi Germany, which was socialist, to the Soviet Union in its communist form, to North Korea, Zimbabwe, Venezuela. You can think of all the failed dictatorships and fascist countries, which were all based on the use of force. And now I want to try and draw this line for you throughout history, that collectivism, there's nothing radical about it. It's from earlier societies. You can even talk about one tribe trying to take over another tribe when people were still nomadic, when the majority of people on the globe were still nomadic. There is nothing radical about collectivism, about the notion that one person is entitled to control the life and the liberty and the property by implication of another person. Now, colonialism and apartheid were simply modern incarnations of this idea that if you have a noble goal, you are entitled to use the power of the state. So to me, there's nothing truly radical about radical economic transformation as it has been used in the last 5 or 10 years, because it inherently increases the power of the state over people's lives. You can pin up whichever goal you believe is moral. So for example, you see inequality as a serious problem, wealth inequality, and therefore you justify your interventions in people's lives by saying, oh, well, you're trying to fix inequality and it's a moral endeavor and it's in favor of social justice. But inherently you're still using force. You're going to impose quotas on people, on companies, on society. You're going to intervene in other ways. You might tax a certain group heavier than other groups. You might try and do it in more subtle ways through other taxes. But the point is that you're going to use force to try and enforce your utopian ideal. Now, to me, capitalism is the only... any capitalist society, and we know we've never had a perfect capitalist society, but societies which tend more towards capitalism tend to produce more economic and personal freedom than societies which lean towards the leftist socialist side, with more state intervention and more state control. So to me, capitalism is the only idea probably in human history which is truly radical, because it's based on the notion that the individual is primary, whereas collectivism and statism are based on the idea that the group or the state is primary, and that the individual should be, the interests at the very least of the individual should be sacrificed for the good of the group. Capitalism sees, I know it's difficult to think of an idea as seeing something, but just try and consider this. It sees people as, at least let's say it holds people as individually responsible, and in order for them to live their lives best as they see fit, which it considers a moral thing, a moral ideal, people need to be free. If you impose force on people, you violate their ability to live, to use their minds, to interact with reality. If you use force, you try and compel them to act in certain ways which you think is moral, but which might not be. But you use it under the guise of your own justifications. So that's what I mean when I say capitalism. Capitalism is true radical economic transformation, because under capitalism, each person is responsible for growing their own wealth pie. The people are supposed to be left free so that they can best choose how they're going to live their lives. And in order to do that, they need to be free to look around them, to assess their environment, to assess their own skills, and then decide how they're going to live. If wealth creation is one of the paths they want to pursue, then the moral way for them to do that, according to the capitalist ideal, is to do so voluntarily with other people. You might have heard this before, but I'm hoping that this is sort of a good way for you to think about it. In a free society, the only way for you to become wealthy is to appeal to voters, in effect, because people are voting for your business over others if they spend their hard-earned rands for your goods and services over another. Under a statist and collectivist society, you are compelled to act in certain ways. There's no competition for your attention and for your rands. You're extorted and heavily taxed, and you have to give your money, for fear of incarceration and punishment and that sort of thing. So that's what I'm trying to get at with saying that capitalism is true radical economic transformation. There's nothing radical about trying to take away people's individual liberty. There's nothing radical about trying to compel people to act in certain ways. There's nothing radical about these new social engineering and control plans, such as the national health insurance, which takes away doctors' right to their own lives, because they're going to be forced to work in certain areas, and people will be forced to pay into a system. And then expropriation without compensation, which takes away all South Africans' rights to property, including physical land property, cars, homes, everything else. It's not just limited. Don't make the mistake of thinking that expropriation without compensation is just limited to agricultural land. So when you see these instances of a government, or maybe a group outside government which is trying to get into power, if they angle for any policy which increases state control, try and divorce that from any hint of radical economic transformation, because anything fundamentally that increases state control continues the historical, tendency or plan for the state to control people's lives, and capitalism goes directly against that, because it's the only system that places the individual above the group. And that's my moral ideal, is for the individual to have primacy in society, to be free, for people to be free to live as they deem best. And therefore, I guess it's a way of insidious doublespeak to say that radical economic transformation is about caring for people and wanting the best for them, because at the end, the results from that are starvation and famine, and grave mass murders being committed. The over millions, hundreds of millions of people who have been killed in socialist and communist societies stands testament to the power of ideas and the power of the wrong ideas. I think you can you can look at the empirical data, so you can make the pragmatic argument for free markets and say that they increase people's welfare, people's own welfare exponentially more than more state-controlled societies. But I think it's also important to make the moral argument. Any society that's based on force, such as a socialist or communist society, is morally bankrupt. The only moral societies are those which are based on individual rights, individual property, free speech, and the rule of law. So I sort of wanted to use this podcast just to explore the idea of radical economic transformation a bit, for you to hopefully have a few tips and tools to look at these, when politicians especially bandy these words about, because we're coming up to elections now in South Africa in May, and I'm sure more and more promises are going to be made of what the state can do for us, and not, therefore we should give up more of our own liberty so that the state can look after us and care for us because we're all so incapable of looking after ourselves. I think it's very important to define one's concepts and to try and talk as clearly as possible, regardless of whether you're engaging with people who might support you or be opponents. But my in my readings of the ideas and my understandings, it comes down to voluntary interaction versus force, and anything that entrenches force cannot be considered radical, because it simply continues the trend throughout history, as I've said, of the state trying to control people's lives. Please let me know in the comments below what you've thought of this episode. If you have any other aspects that you would consider that I might not have, or that you would like to discuss with me or with each other, please leave those below. Please remember to subscribe to this channel. Just click on the big red button, and please like and share my episode with your friends and all around. Please also remember to follow the FMF on Facebook and Twitter, and please share all of our work. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you have a good rest of your week. Goodbye.